in talk back. So welcome everyone to the third annual Jasia Reichardt lecture. Today's lecture is delivered by William Latham. Now we have two esteemed guests. We have Jasia herself is here, and of course this lecture series is in her honour. Very important.
So what?
Now, I've sometimes called you a curator, and you say I'm not a curator. I'm an exhibition organizer. Correct. So, an esteemed exhibition organizer, of which cybernetic serendipity is probably the most well known. Almost, so I was going to say 50, but no, almost 60 years ago. Amazing. Everyone's talking about it. You didn't imagine back then. 60 years later, people would still be talking about that important exhibition. I mentioned this is the third. The first was by Jasia herself. Last year's was by Francesca Franco. And the third, this one, is by William Latham. I'm not going to give an introduction to William because that's going to be done by Bronac. But I am going to give you a little overview of tonight's plan. So a very short introduction from me. Introduction from Bronac. William will talk for an hour or so, and then there'll be time for questions. And then those of us in the room will be able to go into the other area and have a glass of wine. I'm afraid we can't offer that service for our online visitors. I have mentioned that we are going to be recording it, and the recording will go on the Computer Arts Society website. And then maybe the final thing I should say is actually, of course, this is organised by the Computer Arts Society. We are physically here at the BCS in London. Computer Arts Society is a special interest group of the BCS. And my name's Sean Clark. I'm the current chair of the Computer Arts Society. Do follow us online, Computer Arts Society on Facebook and Instagram and some other places as well, or visit our website. Okay, so I will now hand over to Bronac Ferran, who is a writer, exhibition organizer, stroke curator, many other things. And you're going to give us a little introduction to William. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean, very much for that introduction, and to Computer Arts Society for organising tonight's event. And also thank you everyone who's listening online as well as here in the room. I was very honoured when I was invited to moderate the event. My particular thanks go to Paul Brown, who was actually responsible for introducing me to William around 2003, 2004. And my thanks also to William for the invitation to join in a discussion with him after his brief entree. I just wanted to start by reading out something that was shown to me recently via Cory Doctorow and my friend John Hawkins, which was a commentary on William written in 1991 for a game conference by the wonderful novelist Sterling. Sterling said of William in the middle of this paper that he gave at the conference, "I don't know if you've seen the work of a guy called William Latham. I got his work on a demo reel from Media Magic. I never buy movies on video, but I really live for raw computer graphic demo reel. This William Latham is a heavy dude. His tech isn't that impressive. He's got some kind of fairly crude IBM mainframe CAD program in Winchester, England. The thing that's most immediately striking about Latham's computer artworks, remember this is 1993, ghost sculptures as he calls them, is that this guy really possesses a sense of taste. Fractal art tends to be quite garish. Latham's stuff is very fractally and organic. It's utterly weird, but at the same time is very accomplished and subtle. There's a quality of ecstasy and dread to it. There's a sense of genuine enchantment there. A lot of computer games are stuffed to the gunwale with enchanters and wizards, so-called magic, but that kind of sci-fi called mysticism seems very dime store stuff by comparison with Latham." So I can't say anything to add to that. I thought I would read it to you, and I have to share the link later as well. It's all there online to read. Just to bring us a little bit up to speed, in 2003-04, I was in a meeting with Paul Brown, and we walked up to Victoria Station, and suddenly William and Paul said hello. I hadn't met William before that. Paul introduced me to William, And we subsequently had a conversation. I was lucky enough to be running a little unit at the Arts Council, and we were putting money into things that looked like they were breaking the rules around IP and open source and all those things that weren't really associated with the arts at that time. And we managed to put a little bit of funding in William's direction in response to an application, of course, which led to him producing a report which he called Mutation Code Resurrection. And I still have the CD with the report and indeed the code, which you're welcome to look at. I haven't obviously put it in a machine, but it's been in my files. It's one of my treasured artifacts from my time at the Arts Council. And I also found some wonderful little postcards, which are dated 1994, this by Popsoft, Achieving the Impossible with IBM Risk in AIX Technology, published by Computer Artworks London. The image on this was made in 1988, excuse me. It's called Twister One Organic TV. So we can see that, again, there's a patina of value over time accumulating around William, which I recognize from having looked at concrete poetry stuff from the 50s and 60s. This is material that represents a very critical time of emergence, and William was prefiguring figure in the middle of that. It turns out he was also prefiguring in my own life, again, to do with trains. And my first real job was in Winchester around 89, 90, 91. And I used to take the train down from London every day and come back in the evenings. And there was always somebody on the train, or at least regularly, who caught my eye. I don't remember anybody else really, but he'd sit with a group of other chaps who were wearing suits, and he had longer hair. And we'd all get off at the railway station and walk into the centre of Winchester, because Southern Arts, where I was working, was very close, I think, to IBM. So we were like this sort of camaraderie, which it was only when I met William in 2003 that I recognised that this person had stayed in my mind from that parallel train journeys. And then I just wanted to close with saying that in 2012, I did do some curation. I was guest curator at Cambridge School of Art, and William very kindly allowed me to show some of his work. There were 10 screens in the gallery, digital screens, so his work worked brilliantly on these 10 screens. We also showed some of the early print works, because they had a great print studio in that gallery. It's part of a book that came out afterwards. I did an interview with William, which he said, which we called like Escher on Acid. I'm going to return to this during the discussion afterwards. But it struck me rereading it that, again, he was really prefiguring. He was saying that it was a midpoint, that point in 2012, and that he was just beginning to work with Imperial College, combining art, computer engineering, and bioinformatics like a trinity, if you like. Talked about the flow synth flow diagrams that he'd taken from Winchester into this period in 2012. And then he talks later about that as opening up in his mind towards perception, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. And at one point in the interview, he says that he felt that was going to be the final completion point of this phase of research. So he was so ahead of the curve and visionary in foreseeing. I think we're going to hear all of it tonight, so I'm not going to say anything more, but let's welcome William Latham. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you for a lovely introduction, Brona. And yeah, absolutely delighted to be here, and very pleased to be giving the Jasia Reichardt your lecture. For many years, been a big influence on me, particularly in the curation space, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Thank you to Paul Brown in Australia, Davis, Sean, of course, David and the BCS team, Logan and Sam for all. So it's quite a long talk, but we're going to cover the history of the work right the way through to some of the new work. This is an image which is real time, showing in Shanghai. I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future. It's great back doing more stuff in London again. The last keynote I gave was in Taiwan, tail end of 2024. So, going to move forward. Excuse me, so credit to Jasia. And all this talk is primarily going to be about what I call an alternative evolution. And it's the one single driving idea behind all my work, everything that I do. In fact, you could almost call this talk how to get a long way on one single idea. One idea. So this is an example. This is new work that Stephen Todd and I have been working on, called Blue Worms Breaking Free of Their Structural Constraints and Heading Towards Chaos. So this is an amalgamation of our form grow grammar, our mutator code, C-synth graphics work that we've done with molecular graphics, all welded together to create this alternative evolution, like an illusion of a living entity. And these are some of the fruits of this alternative evolution. And once we set this evolutionary software in motion, it will create forms that almost look natural. This is from about 2020. This is the evolutionary frame that particular form came out of. This one's a little bit earlier, quite an image that's been reproduced quite a bit. Mutation X, ray traced with bump mapping, floating in a black void. This is more recent work in China. This is Beijing, where we have mutator running. I would come back. I'll play that again at the end. Basically, it's the animation is driven by the human person that walks in front of the Connect device, which is positioned by which has a Connect camera pointing forward. We'll come back to that. The talk today covers quite a long period of time. Okay, Brona asked me to show some of the really early work, and I'm going to also be requested to show the really recent work with DeepMind, which is a very interesting collaboration that we're undertaking. So if you read that slide from left to right, we start off in 1979. We move through the work at IBM in Winchester, which covered about a 6-year period from 87 to 93. We'll touch on a bit all the work that I did in rave music and computer games. Then I'm going to talk about Mutator 2 and the work as a professor at Goldsmiths, which became my new home for creative work, as well as teaching as research. And then moving on to the fantasy virus sequence, created whilst we were all in lockdown with the COVID epidemic, through to the infinity mirror images. Then moving forward, I'm going to talk about the work with Google DeepMind, which is the newest work and probably seems to be getting quite a lot of interest, where we have taken one of our shots from the DeepMind work, where we were taking our evolutionary principles attached to them to an AI to drive the evolutionary process, replacing the human with the machine, replacing me as the artist by the AI. And on the right-hand side, you can see the number of generations that it's automatically churning through to get to a diatom 4, which was the evolutionary target. But I'm going to talk about that in some depth. So this is a different way of presenting the summary. And it's going to be chronological. And hopefully, as we take this journey, I'm going to try and talk about the influences, anecdotes, people that were part of the journey. So I'm showing a lot of work in the art world again, after I was in the games industry for 10 years, didn't really show any art. So working with Gazelle, working with Mocha in Shanghai, Taikong Art Museum in Beijing. So resurgence of interest in my artwork. But now we're just going to go back in time to 1979, when I was a 18-year-old student at the Ruskin School of Drawing in Oxford. And I call this sometimes the spiral period or the constructivist structures period. This is a picture of the Ruskin School of Drawing in the middle of Oxford. and I was a student at Christ Church, but spent a lot of time creating art as a student at the Ruskin. These are some of the drawings that I produced during that time, using 3-point perspective, all hand drawn, and the inspiration for many of these drawings came from an art class that I went to. Arlette Bonn, who was a choreographer, visited the Ruskin, took us all to the Museum of Modern Art, and got us all walking in elaborate circles, almost dancing, not quite, none of us were dancers, but these choreographic movements I then translated into drawings. In particular, I had the dancers walking in circles. So I then switched from traditional painting completely. I tried out all sorts of styles and moved to a constructivist way of working. The key thing is what I was able to do was take these 2D drawings and then translate them by projecting them into 3D into big spiral structures. And these were made out of balsa wood, incredibly light, and they hung on frames. Very delicate, very ephemeral, but were sculptures. And then I would also do things like take photographs of the shadows of these sculptures. So again, I was playing with spiral geometry, mathematics to create structures, which I would then capture and turn into large prints. So this is one of the large structures hanging in the Ruskin. I was lucky enough to be in a brilliant year of students, Adam Lowe, here's Wardle, Helen Elwes, Maria Djekovic. It was a fantastic year, and it was a great environment to be working in. But what I was already doing was working with ephemeral forms. Anthony Caro came in and gave a talk with his big heavy metal sculptures, and I just couldn't understand them. Things that are delicate and ephemeral are much more interesting. So influences from that time, Russian constructivism, obviously people like Tatlin, Antoine Pevsner, wonderful work that was produced in Russia just before and after the First World War. Another big influence on me at that time was Kenneth Martin, who did these wonderful drawings using chance. He rolled dice to decide which lines would be drawn in the drawing. And so he was not using a computer, but he was using the principles of chance and constraints. So moving forward in time to 1982, I became a student at the Royal College of Art, and I'm lucky to be doing a 3-year MA degree. And here I am. By 83, I'd started to produce what became the form synth evolutionary drawings. And these drawings take the form of large evolutionary trees. At the top of the sheet are geometric primitives such as cylinders, cubes, cones, and then there are a number of rules which deform those forms. And as you move down the sheet of paper, the forms become more and more elaborate as they're being exposed to these different transforms. So here we have a dodecahedron being operated on by a number of these rules, such as lizard extend, beak, bulge. They were from my human imagination. So what I was doing was using my own brain as the computer, if you like, to draw the outcome of the transform. But I'll get into a little bit more detail on the exact rules. And some of the forms, this is an etching from that period. Some of the forms became very elaborate and reveal, to a certain extent, my weakness for decoration. So at this point, I was preoccupied with evolution. And this is really at the point where that's, as I mentioned, the single idea took hold. And this was what's going to be the driving force for all the work moving forward. And as I'll mention later on, I was spending a lot of time in the Natural History Museum, which was right next door to the Royal College of Art, looking at the products of evolution, and in particular dinosaurs, ammonites, snake skeletons, all this material. And the idea here was, can a human create an evolutionary system to compete with nature? Can human creativity be as novel? So here we are, me in the studio in 1985. And in the background, you can see some three-dimensional sculptures, because the original idea was to use these evolutionary systems to design sculptures, which would then be made out of wood or plastic or clay. To help myself, when I was working on these evolutionary drawings, I created a flow diagram. And this was really, in many ways, my first step towards computational space. So it's quite simple. You select your primitive, you have a rule, a transform, which deforms that primitive. You pick one of those, you decide whether it's a large or small transform. You allow it to be used multiple times if you wish, and you imagine the result, and then you draw the result, and then you go around the loop again and again and again. And so the human becomes subject to the rules that have been created for the human to use. And I would keep varying these rules to create more and more interesting forms. So here we have this kind of simple layout. You can see the geometric primitives across the top, and you can see the bulge operation, the beak operation, being operated on those forms. This was produced a number of big drawings. So unlike conventional Western art, the idea of you have your frame and you do create your work within the frame. With this work, you just added more sheets of paper as you needed them. The idea was that the works would be infinite and could go on forever and ever. So this was one of the early drawings, this is one of the very first form synth drawings that the Pompidou purchased for their collection, plus 4 other drawings. There was a huge version that I did, which was about 30 feet long by 6 feet. But as I mentioned, the aim was to create sculptures from the tree. You'd run the evolutionary system and you'd pick one and it would be made up as a 3-dimensional form. What I thought the challenge was that it's quite laborious making 3D forms, and it was much more exciting playing with this infinite space of possibilities. So the process and potential became the driving force. This is a detail of one of those drawings. So these are early drafts of different flow diagrams that I was using. And the transforms were quite imaginative. So the beak operation was partially inspired by Charles Darwin observation that with finches, they had different beaks based on different islands. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just add the beak operation, one of my rules within my grammar. Aesthetically also tended to mean you get spiky forms against rounded forms. So there was an aesthetic driver there. I knew that I needed to have a spiky operator as well as a bulge, which is much softer and more rounded. And the contrast was going to be interesting. Then what I did, very, very early days, wrote some software which would take the flow diagram and kick out drawing instructions, which I would then have to draw. And what was interesting with this was that there was no limit on taste. The machine has no sense of sensibilities, and the human just had to draw whatever the machine told it. And so what I found by using this very, very simple random number generator with drawing instructions, it would take you into very interesting areas of multi-dimensional form space. The work coincided with the form synth coincided pretty much exactly with Richard Dawkins' Blind Watchmaker. And I remember John Lansdowne, who was co-founder of the Computer Arts Society, coming into my space at the Royal College of Art, said, William, you need to read this first paper. There was a paper before the book. And Dawkins uses his biomorph system to explain the principles of evolution. And we'll come back to Dawkins' work later on, when we're also going to have a quick look at Carl Sims' work, and how that work all tied up. So this was my starting point. I was starting to move away from the traditional art world into the computing space. It's worth remembering at that time, there were no PCs, definitely no mobile phones, photocopy if you're lucky, but big mainframe computers that were in chilled spaces. So very quickly, once I finish off and see things, I spent a lot of time in the Natural History Museum. I spent a lot of time in the V&A looking at tantric art, Shiva characters with multiple arms. John Lansdowne, as I mentioned, was a big influence. He was my supervisor for my PhD. And John had done amazing work on the Alien movie and had also done interesting work with the National Ballet. Here is a rather nice photo of the British Computer Society 20th anniversary conference. And in the photo, we have John Lansdowne, we have John Vince, Gillian Crampton-Smith, but also Mike King, who did a lot of work with me whilst I was doing the form synth work, trying to find ways of translating that into the computing space. And he was very, very helpful to me in getting me up to speed in terms of rendering, 3D geometry. This was a conference. John got me writing my first academic paper on the evolutionary rules. And I'm very pleased now that got me to sit down and write a paper, because people are still reading that paper. We all looked a little bit younger, all looked a little bit dated, but that was the group photo at the end of the conference. And there's always been this great relationship between the British Computer Society and the Computer Arts Society. And at that time, I also started to attend the Computer Arts Society, which was chaired by John. Everyone would sit round in tables. They were either in St Martin's and Longacre or the System Simulation Office in Covent Garden. And they were very, very informal. And, at that time, computer art was not considered art. So you always felt it was a slightly rebellious society you were a member of. And John would always have some interesting paper or work to present. Another big influence on me at this time was Edoardo Palozzi, big personality, obviously famous for his silk screens, his giant sculptures. And I had some pretty amazing conversations with him. And I said, I've just been offered a job in Soho to become an operator on a Quantile paint box. And I said, should I leave academia and go and do that? He said, yes, go and do that. Just get out there, do whatever is involved with it, whatever's newest. And he said, do you want to be a poor artist? You want to take people out for expensive dinners? He's saying, don't hang around, just do whatever is most exciting. Hugely talented individual. And, also visited his studio in the King's Road. And as I walked into his house, there were cut up magazines everywhere. All the elements that appear in his silk screens were cut from magazines. And you couldn't even sit down. There was paper everywhere, scissors. Very, very interesting man. Another work from that period. Moving forward, Bridgelow was my other PhD supervisor, and he was heavily involved with Islamic pattern drawing and worked with Buckminster Fuller. And he has a particular interest in complex polyhedra. What was interesting about Keith was he absolutely hated computers with an abhorrence. He said, for me, drawing is a meditative process. Why would you want to use a computer, those ugly things, to replace that meditative process? Very interesting perspective. from him, I got quite a lot of my interest in how complex polyhedra can move from one shape to another using simple rules that fed into the evolutionary idea. And then also Benoit Mandelbrot's idea of iteration, which is implicit in the form synth drawings. Other influences, Conway's Game of Life, I was aware of, Henkel's biological images, also influenced Andy Lomas in his work later on. Another interesting influence was Henry Moore. I was the Henry Moore scholar at the Royal College of Art, which was very nice. And I visited him at his studio in Much Haddam. And anyway, he took me into his studio and he was chiseling away on his work. It suddenly struck me that this is like a caveman. It's so primitive what he's doing. And obviously, Henry was a hugely talented artist, but it struck me how to create forms for him was a lot of labor, a lot of chiseling. And I thought, how can an artist be limited by physical limitations? The form has to be freed from labor. And this is one of the reasons why I started getting more and more interested in computing, was that the labor would be removed from the human and in doing so freed up the imagination. Other influences, Paul Brown, many years, famous for his work at Slade, working with Chris Briscoe, who sadly died last year, and also Paul's amazing work using cellular automata, which I've already cited. Interestingly, Paul offered me my first job at Middlesex Polytechnic, where he was running the computer graphics group there. And very, very sadly, I had to turn him down because I'd just been offered my fellowship at IBM. And Paul has been a big supporter of my work over the subsequent years. So moving forward in time, conscious of time, Sean is going to crack the whip if I slow down. Going forward in time, 1987, where I moved to IBM. What was interesting was how my IBM collaboration started. I rang them up, a cold call. I got talking to Peter Quarrendon, who was a physicist there, told him what I've been doing with my evolutionary drawings, and he said, come down and see us. Anyway, I went down to Winchester, Peter Quarrendon, even Todd, and the graphics research group came into the big lab, and I rolled out these huge drawings on the floor, covering all the floor. There was nowhere for anyone to work. And then they said, yeah, this looks interesting. Tell us about the rules, William. This seems a bit mad, but it looks interesting. And off the back of that, they said, well, that coincides with research that we have in a new programming language called ESME. And why don't you come and join us and we'll see if we can take the principles of these drawings and apply them fully in the software domain. And that's how the collaboration started, just me rolling out all the drawings and them finding it interesting. So I moved from London to Winchester, lived in both places, and obviously, Winchester, in the heart of kind of Celtic culture, which lots of Celtic elements in my work. But in particular, what happened was by moving into IBM, I got access to all their research software, things like Winsome, ESME, and IBM, this group had a long history of working with molecular scientists, archaeologists. There was a surgeon from Brompton Hospital who was working with them. So IBM at that time was running these research centers as think tanks to encourage innovation. And by juxtaposing people with different talents with their best programmers, interesting work emerged. So they were ultimately interested in patents, they were interested in publications, and also PR. And it was the PR that became quite good at generating for them. So this was quite a transition. I moved from a nice art school environment to IBM. And so as I mentioned, these were the types of computers we were using, big IBM mainframes. They'd be housed in a room like this, and maybe one of those would be equivalent to a pretty poor PC right now. But what this did do, working with Stephen Todd and Peter Quarrendon, was it opened up all the algorithmic techniques that the SIGGRAPH conference and other conferences had developed over many years. People like Craig Reynolds, Jim Blinn, Perlin Noyes, this wonderful collection of algorithms and techniques that have been developed. So this now was included into my repertoire. This is where I started working in particular with Stephen Todd. Here we are in the lab on the left-hand side. Again, another photo of the lab. And again, create art and it just cascade everywhere. And I think that's been one of the interesting things about my work. In fact, it's just produced so much, which the art world has always been a bit uncomfortable with. But it was in many ways a return to a kind of Renaissance situation where in Renaissance times artists and architects and mathematicians were working together. So Brunelleschi's handbook on perspective was then picked up by artists. So for me, it was a fascinating time because it was this wonderful juxtaposition of art and maths. Using the computer language that Stephen had written called ESME, which stands for Extensible Solid Modeling Editor, we were able to combine that with a different set of transforms. And these were Boolean transforms, which meant you could either add or subtract forms from one another. Very, very sculptural. But what we then did was we took those principles of addition or subtraction, and then we started to write what became the form grow grammar. And the form grow grammar has a new set of transforms, very different to the beat, bulge, scoop stuff that we've seen back at the Royal College. It's more parametric, but it is definitely very, very organic. It has ribs, it has twists, it has rib cages, has branches. And over time, we elaborated this grammar. So this is a horn and horns, a horn, plus another horn. And as you can see, with a bit of twist and a bit of egg-like scaling, we can start to create forms that look quite natural. There's another example where it's kind of web of forms, where we had this horn grammar, which is made to be symmetric. And also some of the forms would be quite elegant, quite simple, and we'd use the Boolean cutter to cut shapes out of the form. And these the grammar was a little bit like Pandora's box. Once we'd created the grammar and the constraints, the forms that came out of it were very, very rich. And this is probably what still gives our work a kind of signature right now, the crafting of this grammar, which is fundamental to everything we do. So what we then did was we looked at Dawkins' biomorph system plus my original system, FormSynth, and we added mutation to the process. And this is like an evolutionary fruit machine. You have these long instructions which have values, and you shuffle all the numbers, and you do that 9 times. You create 9 variants, and you as the artist pick the best one and breed again. And so you become the selector to drive large evolutionary systems. We developed this idea of the artist as the gardener, and you can see on the right-hand side, that was one of the final aesthetically pleasing forms that I took from the evolutionary tree, and then we rendered up big, 5 feet square. Again, the family is on the right, the left-hand side is the winner from that generation. And sometimes we generate 40 or 50 generations. Challenge by that point, you start to get a little bit tired as a human, but we'll come back to that topic again later on. Me in the lab, going to just move forward. But what's interesting, when the artist is picking from the 9 variants, they're performing the equivalent, they're sort of doing the ink block test. The same way the human sees the gnomes or the bats, everyone in here will see different things. When you've generated forms that have no meaning, they have no inherent meaning, the viewer brings to bear their own interpretation and they decide what they like most. And so every time you present 9 and you pick one, there'll be some reason why the human, which is me at that time at IBM, went for that particular example. When I was picking and breeding my forms, this is all the stuff that was in the back of my mind. Another human would have another viewpoint. Things like flyheads, grim reaper, bedbugs, tapeworm, all this stuff is driving my selection, and this hasn't gone away. So this is another element to my work. I think it's a Gothic Rococo, top, middle, and this is just a selection. So these are the things that are in my mind when I was driving the evolution. So these are some of the forms that came out of the evolutionary system. Most of the time, during this time, I'd have the forms floating in a black void. You feel like that's the last thing in existence, or like a giant meteor float coming through space. There's nothing else, just pure blackness. And I describe these as ghosts of sculptures. They do not exist, but they look three-dimensional. We can rotate that form in 3D, but it does not exist. And people find this work quite uncomfortable at times because it looks natural, but it's also 100% unnatural at the same time. We'll come back to lighting. So this was evolution by aesthetics, and as I'll explain later, we had quite a few exhibitions where we'd show this work to the public. What we were doing using Mutator was we were navigating a multidimensional space of possibilities. So the evolutionary paths we were taking were just single tracks through this space of possible forms, millions and millions of forms out there. And evolution is a very good way of traversing and investigating that space. It also relates to Monte Carlo simulation, where the user or the human is the cost function. So there's a kind of IBM was also interested in this idea of human-driven optimization. Which was, in many ways, this work can be looked at as artistic, but actually below it there was a very strong technical thread that drove it. In many ways, the art is just an expression of the technology. What is interesting with the evolution of form, which is running on four of the screens out there, as you traverse this space, and if you interpolate, the forms go through these beautiful transformations as you move from A to B in multidimensional parameter space. The human has a number of choices: good, bad, marry, so you can crossbreed. You can kill, or you can set the mutation rates. This was my control panel. Another interesting point at this point was that to highlight that the first versions of our grammar were inspired by DNA, spiral structures with secondary structures. So the logic of these forms does have some inherent logic stolen from the space of DNA, and in particular secondary structures. The work at IBM also coincided with Carl Sims's work using iterative function systems, again using an evolutionary system. So quite often the work of us three is kind of grouped together, and Carl, absolute genius, creates some very interesting papers using evolutionary systems. And later on produces his Galapagos system. So moving forward, I'm just conscious of time, influences Mandelbrot. I visited Mandelbrot in his lab at IBM, and all he wanted to talk about was, could you measure beauty? Could you have an automatic filter? Which is coming up again, interestingly, with the work we're doing with DeepMind. And he said, you look at the Parthenon, golden section, that range of scales. Very, very interesting man. A bit like Palozzi, very big personality. He also had a research group around him, Alan Norton, who produced these wonderful 3D fractals, John Hart, and that was all at IBM Yorktown Heights. So definitely by this point, I was kind of navigating the corporate space. Other influences, Margaret Bowden, who's a big ally for many, many years, wrote about creativity, AI, wrote a lot about Carl's work, my work, Dawkins. Definitely an influence and supporter. Roberto Matter, I met in Monte Carlo, took me to his studios in Paris and London. Wonderful late surrealist artist. Again, very bold in his thinking. He wanted me to get my organic forms playing football. He said, everyone likes football, get me playing. Crazy ideas. Other influences were Max Ernst, use of texture, frottage, Magritte. So my listening room sequence is inspired by Magritte's listening room, where the form is put into a small confined space. Rembrandt lighting models. If you've got something floating in the black void, that lighting needs to be very, very moody, very, very minimal. Again, this idea of removing the labor, if you're using a ray tracer, nice reflections, good shadows, you can create results that have a similar quality to Dutch still life painting. Karl Bloesveld with his single forms only, again, an influence. So this idea of the artist as gardener, IBM were interested in the technology, so we did a version for architect buildings, and we also created a version that would drive spreadsheets for financial predictions. So in terms of navigating this corporate space, my father taught me a lot about how to work in a corporation. He worked for ESSO in their labs, and he gave me very good advice, which I think I maintained right the way through. He said, if you're working in a corporate environment, make sure everything you do, you give it a good name. Stick with that name. Do not change it, and stick it on your office door. And within a week, everyone will be talking about that name. It doesn't matter if it doesn't exist yet. Brand it. And so that's something that's kind of advice that's helped me, right the way through. I use names like Mutator, Formgrow, Creative Machine, and never budge and just stick with those titles. So yes, how you navigate the corporate space, because I was an artist operating within IBM, and they sponsored me for six years. Anyway, let's move on. We also produced a 3D version using building information models. So a lot of this work would replace the human architect, and I presented this at the Royal the Society of Architects, told them they'd all be out of jobs. Absolute outcry. Unbelievable. I said, well, look at architecture. It is a kind of evolution. You can see this changing, but it's very interesting. People, if you challenge human creativity, people hate it. That's the one thing that's kind of sacrosanct, human creativity. So we'll come back to that theme again. And then we had different exhibitions, the Empire of Form, Conquest of Form. This was the poster for the show, the one-person show that I had at the Art Museum in Tokyo. Kawaguchi, Naoka Tosa, Kazo came to the preview. And it was at that point I built all my Japanese links. It was a great time. Conquest of Form, which started off at the Arnolfini, ended up touring the UK and Germany for about 2 years. There's just the shots from the gallery. And what was interesting was towards the end, the venues started to become more and more scientific, like the Natural History Museum in London, the Deutsches Museum in Germany. And the audience was a different audience to your art crowd. It was the general public. This was Scientific American. And so, yes, this idea of evolution, and maybe all the art that I'm producing is just a kind of branch, a bit like the Burgess Shale. It's a very peculiar branch of evolution where all the mutations are very, very unusual. But maybe my art is just like a kind of an alternative. Moving forward, all about the work is all about collaborations, and Stephen Todd, Marie, Lance Putnam, I've been very, very fortunate, wonderful collaborations. And what I try and do is where I have a weakness in a particular talent, try and work with an expert who's really, really good at that. This is a photo from a couple of months ago of us working together in Wigston. Peter Todd, Stephen's son, who's also been really involved in coding, is on the left-hand side. Jumping forward, 1993. In 1993, IBM decided to close their scientific centers all around the world. It also coincided with cyberculture. And thanks to Bronac for the quote from Bruce Sterling. That was height of his time as a sci-fi author. So I made the decision of setting up a company in the middle of Soho in an attic. Whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, I'll come back to. But what had happened was that the work at IBM had become quite well known. And so we were seeing commercial opportunities. People would come to us and say, can you produce work in the style you did at IBM, but can you take that style and apply it to a rave album cover? Or can you create some computer animation that we can include in a rave video? And so in particular, a band called the Shaman, who were infamous for taking ecstasy and other drugs, approached me and said, "We love your work, and can you create work for us?" So what then happened, a 3-year collaboration working with the Shaman. I produced all their music videos, a lot of the animation, all the album covers. I had a team with me, about 5 people, including people like Chris Jones, Mark Atkinson, and we had a lot of fun. And they said, you didn't realize it, William. All the time you've been stuck in IBM, in this nice corporate environment, all your work has been shown in garage, raves, warehouse raves. Your work is very well known amongst the rave scene. So what was interesting was that we kind of went along for the ride. These are some of the album covers that we produced, and it was a lot of fun. And Sean also worked with the Shaman at that time, producing websites, if I remember correctly. It was interesting. They kind of gave me carte blanche to do what we liked. I started to let some figurative elements come in, which I regret later. We'd been approached by Warner Brothers, Mattel, the learning company, produce versions of what we'd done on IBM mainframes for the PC. We produced a product called Organic Art, and we did a version for Microsoft. It was very, very popular. People would just be running it on their PCs. So at this point, we were right at the kind of epicenter of the cyber culture explosion, a little bit like now with all the AI, except it's different words like hallucinogenic stuff. Those sorts of terms are being used. Then it was more psychedelic. Cyber culture was the kind of terminology that was being used. So what was happening at this point with technology was moving off mainframes into the PC environment or silicon graphics. We then were approached by Virgin to produce a game called Evolver, which was all about genetic mutation. We also did the famous Robert Miles album cover. And by this point, I had about 25 people working for me. By this point, where Universal Studios approached us to do the sequel to The Thing film, which is a horror film, and they'd known all my work at IBM, which was the reason why they approached me. We had about 70 people in two studios. But by this point, it was a kind of 10 years in, it was a little bit like Dr. Faustus. Had I sold my soul to Hollywood or not completely? Anyway, moving forward to 2005, I was able to escape the world of Hollywood, which had been great. Big budgets, a lot of interesting times, a lot of flying around the world, and became a professor at Goldsmiths, University of London, in the computing department. And this was a great opportunity. So I started my long-term collaboration with Professor Lemery, and in particular, what I did was restarted my collaboration with Stephen Todd, which paused for about 13 years. And what was brilliant, I just rang up Stephen and said, Stephen, you'd be pleased to know I'm back in the kind of academic space. He said, brilliant. And it was just like 13 years had not passed. We picked up exactly where we left off 13 years earlier. Now, the challenge was in 13 years, the software can deteriorate quite a bit. And so what Stephen did was he rebuilt FormGrow, rebuilt Mutator. We were able to salvage the Winsome software. And so we had to rebuild everything, but we also had to get it running on the newest GPU. And he also created a new set of libraries around physics, Infinity Chamber and Optimizer. And so we were then back on track. We were back on form. These are some of the works produced. This is quite an interesting case study. So we were able to find the 3D geometry of the form in the background and re-render it using Winsome. But this time, instead of 2000 pixels by 2000, this was 20,000 pixels by 20,000 pixels, all rendered. And there were details in the original artwork that we never even knew were there by re-rendering it on the new technology. The work also included different background styles, which I'll come back to later on. We did a lot of work starting to show it in galleries, in particular Sue Gollifer, a very active member of the Computer Arts Society, and working with John Pratty at the Arts Council, gave me a one-person show at the Phoenix Gallery in Brighton. And we called it Mutator 1 and Mutator 2. I mean, it's going to be both parts. And I hadn't shown the artwork for a long, long time. And it was a great opportunity to kind of get my work public again. And the show went to IMAL also. So these are shots from that exhibition. And in that exhibition, I created some large form synth drawings. But in essence, this time round, with the faster technology, we could let the person in the gallery pick and breed the forms for themselves, which you can see in the image top right. And so these were the types of choices that we were giving the viewer. For example, where we work in real time, but trackers. Back to it. But what also happened at this point was we started to get interest from people in the science community, in particular Steve Taylor, the Weather Institute of Molecular Medicine, Mike Sternberg at Imperial College, who'd seen all the Mutator work over the years and said, can you take your engine and apply it to the scientific domain? And if you remember, the loose inspiration from DNA, so there was a common denominator. And so we then expanded our technology to include scientific content. Mike Sternberg drew the analogy right from the start. The grammar that you're using is very similar to the beta barrel geometry and then rules that is being used by nature. And we then adapted the Mutator code to be able to visualize things such as viruses, protein structures, RNA, etc. This is just a few snapshots from that work. We also started to take some of these forms and put them into VR. So this is the herpes simplex virus, which a viewer can stand in VR and look at the interior of a virus structure. And this is the view from the inside, absolutely beautiful. We showed this at the Lowry in Manchester. This is other work using Mutator, which was very heavily adapted, I have to admit, for visualizing viruses. So Mutator VR became a real focus for us for a long period of time. Using HTC Vive, we put on VR experiences in raves again, such as this is the Shoom 30th anniversary. So this was all happening in real time. This is work we showed in Kyoto, and this was a wonderful venue. It was a 500-year-old Buddhist temple, and we were able to place our VR works in there. How am I doing for time?
20 minutes.
Okay.
20 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to try and so these are views in VR. This is within a few seconds in VR that has closed up and reformed into another different types of flower structure. I'm just going to get through these. So we showed Mutator VR at the Pompidou Center in around 2020, just before lockdown. This is Stephen working in the Pompidou. It's interesting with these projects, wherever you go, you tend to set up your own little small development environment wherever you're showing your work. And one of the big problems as an artist is bug fixing. Because you want to keep pushing the quality, doing what tends to happen is you suddenly realize you've done all this brilliant experimentation, but this software's got to run for a month without crashing. And so, because Stephen and I are just so kind of creative at times, we have this kind of slightly nightmare scenario trying to debug at the last minute. It's got a lot better now, but it's one of the challenges with art and software development. So the VR work was shown in Shanghai, Kyoto, St. Petersburg in particular. The Silent organization were very, very big supporters of our VR work. Okay, moving forward. So I won't go into too much detail. The challenge with VR is, particularly with HTC Vive, you're not waving your hands around, you're using a controller. So you've got to take the controller and map the functionality on that controller to all your organic transforms. So we spent a lot of time remapping functionality to the controllers so that if a person went into VR for the first time, it would be completely intuitive. They wouldn't have to learn anything. They could just immediately get an idea of what they needed to do. So here, if you move your hands, the form will change shape in front of you. And if you hit the trigger, then it'll mutate. Very quickly, one of the challenges with VR, particularly when you've got a system like ours, which is churning out and growing forms the whole time, it can be like a thicket. There's so much content around the viewer, they actually don't see anything. So what we then had to do was, give them lights to actually illuminate the scene. So you have a miner's lamp attached to the person's head and a torch to their hand, but also you have a Boolean cutter to cut around the person's head and around their hands to make sure that the content is not completely overpowering them. And a lot of what we did in the VR space was kind of real and unreal, inspired by science fiction. Again, it's always been a big influence on my work. We created the Vortex, which was developed with Lance Putnam, where we're using force fields and agents to create a kind of organic experience with the mutation process around the viewer. To some of the maths that Lance Putnam had developed. So moving forward, off the back of all the scientific work we did, we created the Fantasy Virus series, which was produced during lockdown. And so this is using our form grow grammar. It has a lot of similarities to real life viruses. It has a core, which is a little bit like the DNA or the RNA. You can see that in the middle. And it also has a kind of capsid shell. And in this instance, the mutations have grown spikes, a little bit like COVID virus that was, dominating life at that time. So I was working on my PC at home in my bedroom. Stephen was on Skype and TeamViewer. And whilst the country was in the middle of this epidemic, we were evolving aesthetically pleasing viruses. You cut them open, a little bit like the way the viruses were being presented on TV. But these were fantasy viruses. There's a series of 100. And on screens, so this is some of the working drawings that Stephen and I used at that time to work out the cutting process that would cut holes out of the virus form. For me, the virus form has some similarities to pumpkin forms, which I've always had a strong interest in. So more from the fantasy virus series. So off the back of all the scientific work, I spent a lot of time looking at electron microscopy. So this is some of the content that I'm interested in. This is pollen. This is a picture of a fly's back with these amazing growths coming out the side. As soon as you go down to a microscopic level, it's another world. This is the kind of space that I want my work to be associated with. But off the back of that work, we created a mirrored chamber. And so our mutated form, which is in the middle, is being reflected multiple times. So it's inspired by electron microscopy, but we're using multiple reflections. This is a series of 100, and this is my kind of more decorative side coming out again. These are not forms floating on a black void. These are highly decorative structures being reflected an infinite number of times. So moving forward, this also started to get me interested in AI, whether we could live content or spot content within these models. Inspiration from William Morris. William Morris had a cottage garden where he'd go out and pick thistles or flowers and then translate those into woodblock patterns. So in some ways, I'm doing something a little bit similar to William Morris, except I'm using Mutator to generate things that look like tapeworm, whereas William Morris was using flowers and thistles and bluebells. Okay, we're kind of where I wanted us to be by this point. So since 2024, we've been collaborating with Google DeepMind, with their research group in King's Cross. In particular, working with Dylan Banas, who is a senior engineer at Google DeepMind. And so the principle of what we're doing is fairly simple, as I'll explain in the next few slides. The work to date by October last year resulted in an exhibition called Evolution and Foundation, picture of me, Dylan and Stephen at the opening of the show. And what this is all about is whether we can take our FormGrow and Mutator technology and plug into it Google DeepMind AI. And if we do that, can the AI replace the artist as the human selector completely? And these are some of the works that have emerged from it, and I'll get onto a little bit in detail. So still, this single idea, the one good idea that I had in however many years ago was when I was at Royal College of Art, is still driving the work forward. Can AI be used to generate evolved forms? This is one of the forms that we've created, which is a strange kind of rose form. This is generation 190. These are evolutionary drawings where diatom is the target. So Dylan was very aware of all the work we'd done at IBM, and there were three things that were a shared interest. The ink blot test, whether the AI could perform the ink blot test as well as the human, or maybe better. 16th century painter Archibaldo, and a strong interest in generative grammars. And one of the key things is the human selector. You remember me sitting at IBM with the big mainframe making selections. After about 50 generations, the human's beginning to struggle a little bit. With AI, there's no limit, thousands of generations. So this, as we find out quite quickly, has huge potential. So the question is, can the computer do the AI selection? Can the AI spot the gnomes? Can it replace the human? And if the AI is going to replace the human, do we have to train the AI on a set of aesthetically pleasing forms, maybe the types of forms that I'm interested in? This is the painter Archibaldo. We can see where there's kind of grammar, heads made out of branches, or so we said, well, if we follow Archibaldo's path, maybe the horn grammar could make up forms that look like chickens or animals or bears. It doesn't really matter. But the first thing that we had to do was Stephen and I had to do a bit of work to prepare Mutator and form grow. I'm going to try and move these. So we revisited structure mutation, which proved to be extremely important. And we also revisited parametric mutation. And in particular, what we did was we built an editor, which you can see on the left-hand side, which we could use to rehearse the types of moves that the AI would make. So we could work out whether the results were going to be good through a particular set of sequences or bad. And we changed the values, the amount of mutation, the minimum max values accordingly. So this kind of hand rehearsal was very, very important. So when we connected up the two systems, the forms that would be generated would not be rubbish. These were some of the drawings that I did at that time. We also wrote a bit of software called Pixel Score, which was proved to be extremely useful. It stimulates complexity. What it does is it creates multiple structure mutations across all the variant children. I won't go into this tonight in detail. So this is where we're starting to connect Gemini up to Mutator. And in particular, what we have is Mutator and FormGrow on one side of the fence, and then Gemini on the other. And what we do is we generate the variants, chuck them over the fence to Gemini. Gemini scores them, says this looks most like a fly's head, and then picks the winners and passes them back to Mutator. Mutator takes the winners, breeds again, chucks them over the fence to Gemini, and we go round and round and round. Now, Gemini is performing the selection process. The other thing what's great with the Google DeepMind AI, you can ask it questions. You can say, what is this? And it'll come back. And so these were some of our mutations. On the right-hand side, it's recognized what is a fossil, but it's not a fossil. It's just come out of Mutator. So what we're starting to see now is that the machine, sorry, I'm going to sit down for a minute. Can everyone hear me still? So what's fascinating is that the machine is bringing meaning to something that has no meaning. This is Mutator churning out variants, and it's saying, well, this one looks like a fossilized structure. And what this enables us to do is say, great, we produced a fossil, breed again from that one. Then what happened was DeepMind said to us, within our research group, we have a litmus test that we use for all our software. Does it look like a chicken? This is a great comment. And so what we were able to do was we put in the prompt chicken, and by the time we'd gone through 200 generations, we start to get some fairly primitive chickens on the right-hand side. Not perfect, but there's a beak there, there's a crest, there's elements of a feather. Maybe it's a slightly cubist chicken, which looks like a chicken. So in 200 generations, the machine making the selection, all we've told it is look for chickens, it manages to breed chicken looking like forms for us. And these were other variants that we created. Not bad. And I'm out of a job. Okay, so more chickens. Now, what I would say is on these diagrams, we're only showing the highlights. Every single one of those triangular points represents a family of four that have been rejected. And the red line shows the most successful lineage through this sequence of forms. So this is where Akebono played out as we kind of anticipated. But what you can do is add different prompts. So this is flyhead, where we start off with a stack of spheres, generate variants from that, and it goes round and round. I'm not going to talk about the technology in detail, but this is the architecture of the system that was built where we have mutator on one side and it's using this AI system on the right-hand side. But in a nutshell, all we're starting off from is a stack of spheres, nothing else, plus our grammar.
What about colour?
It sorts out color as well. It will find color. Good question, Jasia. But this, within 200 generations, we get some fairly reasonable flyheads. So what's happening is as I mentioned, we do the mutations, we chuck the winners over the fence, it does the scoring, and then it passes them back. And what's interesting is the machine is better at spotting the best candidates. So the human will say, well, that looks like chaos. The machine can spot order in the chaos and pick the best ones better than the human can. So these are some of the flyheads that we got to within 200 generations. This is the parents of all the 46 generations that are on the winning scenario. It takes a little while to get going, but by the middle bottom row, we're starting to get some reasonably good flyheads emerging. And what was also interesting, we deliberately gave it keyword prompts such as horseshoe crab or dinosaur to see, if it was capable of producing things that have a highly naturalistic look. This was a very interesting one. A little bit hard to see at first. The prompt was chameleon. It took quite a long time to find one, but he finds it. It's kind of a bit of a mixture of a branch with a lizard, but maybe second row down to second column. That's a reasonable chameleon. But that's just 200 generations from a stack of spheres with our form grow grammar, which is using keywords such as branch, ribcage, bend, twist, stack. Pretty simple mathematical functions. So these are our horseshoe crab generations, 200 generations in, viruses. What we've also thought about is, well, these are just single prompts. What about capturing every prompt that I'm interested in? Maggots, tadpoles, tapeworms, bed mites, centipedes. Can we take all those prompts, all the prompts that that an artist like me would be interested in? So you have like a super list of all the prompts possible. And this is what we're working on right now, open-ended evolution. Now, the blind watchmaker with Dawkins said that evolution changes track. So by implementing a system of this sort, the system can start to change track. At the moment, a lot of our work has been around targeted evolution. But this is what we're working on now. It's open-ended evolution, which a human is very, very capable of doing, changing direction. And so it's not a simple problem because you're generating variants, the AI has to make a decision. I'm no longer going for chickens, I'm going to go for ammonites, because a great looking ammonite, bottom right, throw away chickens. A human is very, very capable of that. This is this kind of open-ended evolution that we're working on. This was a little bit inspired, this idea of endless art. This could run for many, many years, inspired by John Cage's organ piece, As Slow as Possible, which is going to run for about 10 years. Humor. Why am I including humor here? Well, one of the interesting things about the AI Gemini is there's quite a lot of humorous images. They're not just serious fly heads, the ones that I'm after. There's a whole lot of fly heads which are quite humorous from the world of entertainment. So some of the fly heads that we evolved, which was the target, are quite humorous fly heads, such as this one. So there's been a lot about AI and aesthetics, but this is one of the things I'm learning. The AI gives you things you don't always expect. So here I asked for a dinosaur, and I was imagining some of the creepy dinosaur photos that I'd looked at books when I was a child, and it gave us this quite humorous, friendly little dinosaur on the right-hand side. Spiky dinosaur was the prompt. I was expecting a big creepy one, and we got a kind of quite friendly one. So as the artist, it's taken me into a world of humor. This is where I asked for a smiling face, more smiling faces. And then we're back to diatoms. Interestingly, Dylan, I knew my old drawings from way back, and that's why we have lots of lines and arrows showing the lineage. There's a definite revisiting of the original form synth idea. You show the whole history of the form. This is targeted evolution. Is it like the blind watchmaker? And we've got form, grow, mutate, a Gemini, prompt, and watch. So just as an interesting prompt, we put the word watch, and we get some fairly good watches pretty quickly. We get a wristwatch, we get a pocket watch. I don't quite know the significance of it, but it definitely is targeted evolution, not the free roaming evolution that Dawkins and other people have talked about. So I'm just going to move through these. So it's all about collaborations, finding the best people to work with, and seeing what comes out of this mixture. So I won't talk about the creative machine too much. So I do a lot of work in China. Probably the work is better known in China than the UK. This was the creative machine, the first one that we hosted at Goldsmiths, backed by the Arts Council in 2014. And it's a way of bringing together artists that are of interest to us. They normally have an AI or robotics feel. Patrick Tressay, we've exhibited, Memo Acton. We did a creative machine at Oxford University. And we often have a symposium. This was China, and the scale of things in China is just phenomenal. So we one exhibition at the Taikang Art Museum in Beijing. We had 15,000 plus visitors. So what I'm finding in China, things that you want to do on scale in the UK or Europe, you can't do in China. In China, you can. This is the show at the in Wuhan at the Wanlin Art Museum. And this is the younger audience enjoying Mutator running on a huge screen. And it definitely, as you engage with the public, you realize you've got to produce work that can be enjoyed by all age groups. And this is them. Okay, time-wise, am I okay? 5 minutes, okay. So finally, looking towards the future, these are some of the things I'm thinking about. Dangers of eye candy. Not really need to say much. A lot of fluid dynamics stuff being done. Nice eye candy for me. I want a lot more structural biology, a lot more intention in the work. Black box AI is something we're already encountering. With Dylan, the system is exposed to Stephen and me. We can tweak all the parameters, but black box AI has pros and cons. More shows in China. What next? Ongoing collaboration with DeepMind. Maybe bringing the creative machine back to the UK. Who is the audience? Is something I've been thinking about. Taking more information from structural biology. But one thing we're talking about a lot is how do we pull in more science back into the work without swamping the art? As soon as you start to bring all the DNA content back in, there's a lot of rich material there. And And so at the moment we're keeping it at bay a little bit, but definitely the science element will creep back in. We're having a lot of fun with the AI at the moment, so that's probably going to keep us busy. Started to doing some drawings again. And coming back to my comment about names, we're still pushing on these single names. They're kind of the framework moving forward. Thinking about drawing. And this is the final slide. On the left-hand side is one of my drawings when I was age 8, which is a pattern that I drew. Within the pattern, I spotted a cockerel. The cockerel was not the starting point. The pattern was the starting point. And that has a lot of similarities to what we're doing right now. Spawning patterns, geometry, and then finding order within those patterns. On the right-hand side, is a lot older than 8. But again, drawing is still really, really important. And within the communication within the team, absolutely vital. That's the end.
I think that was an amazing talk, and I was more than happy for William to run on a bit because I was just in France, where you were as well. I'm going to recount something I told you earlier, that when we first met in the 90s, it was at your office, Computer Artworks, and you were doing some new cover art, Shaman, and materials for some of their activities. And you gave me some advice. You said, if you have a great idea, stick with it. It was in mid-90s, 96. And I think you've proven why that is great advice, because you've had a great idea, you stuck with it, and it's taken you in such incredible directions. You've gone through VR and AI and growth now in more powerful computers and everything. So that's great advice. When you get your good idea, stick with it. I think I've only just found one. I think what we will now, what we're now going to have is time for a few questions. So, Brona, I think, is going to lead on this initially.
Do we not need to be? No.
Well, I'm going to double check, but I'm hoping that the microphones in the room are picking us up so that the audience online.
Okay.
And hear us. So I think the way this will work, I think you wanted to have some make some comments.
I think that's
yeah, that would be great.
Yes.
I'm going to go and check to see what online things we have.
Great, thank you.
And then give ourselves 15 minutes. It's a little bit shorter, if that's okay, just for some questions.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks very
Let's
much.
go for it. William, that was brilliant. Is it okay if I sit down as well, or shall I'll come round?
Sure, sitting down's fine, yeah. Let me just check that the audience online can hear us.
William, that was a tour de force. I'm sure people have lots of questions, so I'm not going to hog the floor. However, there are 2 questions I'd love to ask you. And thank you so much for how you ended the presentation with a slight reflection on, your own critique of where you are now and where you might go. So I was thinking that when we spoke in 2012 in this essay, and you said, people interpret images in many ways. For example, a lot of people say they see in my work in overtones. There's a psychological element. The forms can seem deliberately sinister or very joyful. The thing is, when something is evolving, people can feel quite uncomfortable. It can have a real resonance, for example, reminding them of cancers, the mind growth, strange mushrooms in a forest. Quite often you reveal a whole lot of stuff that people immediately associate with, and that's not always such great stuff. But other times it can look like an RNA structure with molecular-like forms dancing along. So I think that's absolutely right. And I now understand more clearly, looking at how you were working with light and darkness, and how that was actually being consciously developed as your practice was evolving, as your aesthetic was evolving. I mean, the thing that strikes me about the recent work is you've lost the macabre almost entirely in what you think, which I do find really interesting, but in another way. With that kind of sort of the spaceship that, the molecules that look like they're the last thing that we see on Earth. I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about that for the animation.
Right. You comment. There's Freudian dimension. Was realists were certainly interested in Freudian content. You know, as being an artist, you're going to grab an audience, you have to have content which is a bit contentious. It's a hard question. So yeah, the psychological space is kind of things like nightmarish, sexual overtones, but it's quite a brutal space that the form grammar lives in. And it's this idea of the infinite. You know, the idea is these forms are just timeless. You know, the forms don't age, and the evolutionary system could keep going and keep going. The macabre has definitely been there with my pumpkin forms that were, you know, a bit like jack-o'-lanterns and things like that. You know, if I'm honest, you know, your audience is exposed to a lot of content. You know, a lot of pornography, people, you know, so that content is bound to creep into the work. But it's what the audience is exposed to.
So certainly the context of reception for your work has changed. You were doing this rather in the margins of certainly a mainstream art world for decades, but now that context is altered and you're now quite rightly being celebrated. I'm not going to...
Good question. I've never really talked about that particular element before. So.
To be continued, hopefully. Yeah. But I don't want to hold back the audience back from asking some questions because our time is limited. So please put your hand up if you have a question. And then we also have some from online as well, which Jeff, maybe we can take one online, one offline. So
yeah, I think Sean might have online questions.
Great. Well, let's start with one in the room. I saw that hand first, James.
Hiya. It was really interesting talk and incredible amount of work. I was very interested in early sketches and diagrammatic evolutions, and I noticed that you started with basic forms, you know, like kind of Platonic form, and you talked about being interested in constructivism, and I was interested to know because obviously there's a continuation of that abstract element that you see in those original conceptual kind of evolutions that you also see later in some of the mutator work and so on. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how abstraction comes into it for you, or how you approach abstraction.
I think it's a good question, James. I think the challenge is when we've got a very mature and complex software system now. The early work, when it was cones and cylinders, I was in direct control. Everything was within. Since you build a really complicated system, you having very, very direct control becomes harder. At the moment, you know, we're heading into new territory in terms of forms and shapes. The figurative element is creeping in, like, you know, flies' heads or horseshoe crabs. You know, there's a figurative element back in which never was, and there were things just abstract. So, but interesting, what's aesthetically often things are most interesting at the halfway point, between the final thing and your starting point. There's a very interesting zone where interesting stuff emerges. But yeah, good question. I don't quite know how to answer.
That's a great answer.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, Sean, I'm really strict. I come in with an online question.
An online question. So this apparently is from ZKM Curators.
Oh, great.
Okay. A question about how development and technology influence the work, and if you ever worked on the connection machine Carl Sims used to produce animation.
Okay, it's a good question. So Carl was using the connection machine. He also showed at the Pompidou Center. We weren't using connection machine, but we were using an IBM mainframe, same level. So not that specific machine, but the IBM equivalent. What was the first part of the question?
A bit about the relationship of developments in technology and how they influence your work?
So I will always ride on the back of technology. I'm always looking what's coming next, plus the traditional good stuff like Craig Reynolds, Berlin Noise, all the good solid stuff. But I am keeping a definite eye on what's happening with AI and whatever. And so with Stephen, who working with, they often will respond and say, "Well, I'm thinking about that already. Why don't we include that?"
Did you have a question?
Yes, great talk. It's answered questions I didn't even know I had about your work, which was wonderful. And one of the things that struck me was how about 10 years ago, I remember you doing a talk where you said you avoided things like pareidolia, where people actually see things in things, but that's interesting. My actual question is, I was amazed to see how you started off thinking about turning the designs into sculptures, into physical objects. Kawaguchi, who's done some really interesting abstract work, has made 3D objects, and I wondered whether you'd considered, we've got 3D printing and so on, going in that direction.
Good question. I get asked a lot. At some point, we've started working in that area. In some ways, I'm probably still more interested in things dynamically evolving. Conceptually, I am taking the art and converting it to an analog form. Joe from the Royal College, as I see, you're the printmaking department. I'm still making prints from the, very much getting out of the computer into a form that can be presented anywhere. But yes, at some point, I think. But a good question.
Sean, do you have?
Right, I've got a couple of questions here. I'm reading through this one. So somebody here comments that there's another evolution at play here, which is the evolution of the software. I wonder if, particularly working with Stephen Todd, how did you know when you needed to add new features or additional complexity to the software?
Okay, so
So that working relationship, how do you?
the working relationship is a lot of time on Zoom, like every day, for an hour, and I'm pushing the system the whole time. I'm asking for stuff. We have a kind of backlog of requests which we prioritize. It's like a stack. What will happen is we'll do like the molecular stuff with physics. We did work with Frederick in the physics space, and then 6 months later, Stephen came back to me and said, "Look, we can free the forms from their structural constraints by doing this particular technique that we developed from all our molecular work." So Stephen is coming up with features. I'm coming up with features. Dylan is now coming up with features. But the challenge is, so I guess the other key thing is I will position an exhibition in 6 months to create a great deadline. It means we have to get, and then another one a year later. So I use exhibitions as software development deadlines that we have to hit.
That emphasizes the importance you made on about collaboration.
Yeah.
You're working as part of a group and you're all feeding ideas in, and the software evolves from that collaboration.
It is a collaboration, absolutely.
We have 2 more questions in the room, one at the back and one at the front. We start with 3. Sorry.
I'll shift up here so you can see me. Thanks so much for that. So you said that your idea that you follow all the way through is evolution.
Yep.
Okay. But the thing about evolution is it occurs in a context. So you showed the 4 finches, and their beaks develop differently because they're in a different kind of context, and so they were adapted to that kind of context. Whereas your evolution seems to be spent a lot of effort to get the context out of it. I mean, you literally said, this occurs, you're showing the images and they're in a void and they're kind of black and they're just kind of not there. And then the thing that you took from the interaction with Henry Moore is, well, he's got the labour and I want to get the labour out of it. I'm kind of wondering why that's so important to you, to kind of get the context out of it, and how would the work be different if you brought the context on which the evolution is based, if you brought it back into your work?
So I guess with the new work with Google DeepMind, the word chicken is the environment. And so we're using the AI's complete knowledge of chickens to make that criteria for the selection. So chickenness is the survival factor, whether one of the variants is going to be bred again or not. So the new work does have, particularly the single prompt work, does have quite clearly defined environments that drive the evolution. The earlier work, it is more ambivalent. I am switching around. I say, well, I like this because it looks like a lobster, and then 10 minutes later, I'll say, well, that looks like a fern. I'll go for that one. But I guess even in the early work, I am the environment. I am the decider what is going to be bred or, and there'll be constraints on my selections, whether I like it or. But that's a very good
So
question.
you're God.
Yeah, maybe. That context. Dawkins talks about, if you're making a selector, you're the criteria. The human can't keep up with the necessary volume of choices. But yes, a very good question.
There's a lady just behind you.
Yes. Thank you. So I hope this isn't too nebulous a question, but it mostly came to me, especially whenever you were bringing up like William Morris, who spoke quite vocally about ethics within the production of his work and the social context and sort of making work for a sort of social good. And I wanted to know, sort of bouncing off of that, how do you feel about the fact that you're using AI and working with AI and the ethics as well, more specifically with Google and Google DeepMind? Do you think about that? How does it impact your work?
A good question. I've done a lot of work with corporations over the year, going back to my dad's reference of how you operate in that environment. I am capable of operating in that type of environment. So you're right to talk about ethics. I would say that a lot of the work which is quite experimental, like the work we did in the medicine space, is benefiting medicine.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So my belief is that if you're doing interesting pioneering work with really, really bright people, there'll be some benefit to society. So the work we did with Mike Sternberg around bioinformatics, he's linked to the kind of cancer research center. There can be a benefit to society. I guess the challenge is you're quite a long way into that path. Yes, I think the challenge is that an ethical point of view, you shouldn't really even be using a computer at all. So where does one put the measure? That's that's a very interesting question. My belief is that if you are doing interesting work and you're publishing it and sharing it publicly for free in academic papers or exhibitions, you are contributing back to society. So there is a benefit. Like Ryden Twarrock's work with virus visualization, she'd learned things about a particular virus that she had no idea about until she got it into VR with our system. And she said, I didn't realize that tube was connected to that one. So, but you're right, the ethics and the benefit to society are a long way into the journey.
I mean, we can say that the Computer Arts Society is a society, and you're doing this, you've shared this for free with all of us. So I think you're right to place it back in the real environment in which we're in. Unfortunately, we have only time for two more questions. I know there was a gentleman at the back, and then Jeff, you have your hand in the air.
Yeah, my question's really quick and relates to that last topic. You're working on, pardon me, you're working with DeepMind on AlphaFold, the biochemical software they have.
To answer your question, we are working not with that group, we're working with the Human Creativity Group, which is a different division. So you might know about the scientific work that we've done. We're deliberately at the moment focusing on human creativity component, particularly around user interfaces. And in particular handing control to the computer for like 200 generations and then taking it back for 10 and then letting it go for 1,000, you know, how you pass creative control back and forth. So I could probably say, I'm allowed to say we're deliberately not doing direct work in the DNA space with the research group that we're working with. But a good question.
Yeah.
So my question is about in your Google DeepMind project, you have, the one where they select the favorite form, right? Is this judged on like 2-dimensional pictures, or is it taking into account the whole 3D form of the fly head or the whatever you're talking? So is this just like, if I was looking at your fly head from that angle, it looks like a fly head, but if I was to select another angle, would it still have the corresponding form?
Good question, and I meant to include that in the presentation. So we are only considered with one viewpoint currently, but we could be looking at it from top down or side elevation at the same time. So we'd only breed successful variants that were good from all viewpoints. So at the moment, if you take one of our fly heads, which look great head on, they look like flies, they got mandibles, they got antennae. If you rotate that, it's going to look like big chaotic at the back. It won't look like a fly because that's not been an evolution criteria. But there's nothing to stop us by having 3 views being measured simultaneously at the same time. But yeah, that you're absolutely right. That we're only concerned with a single viewpoint at the moment, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be 3 viewpoints.
That might be quite interesting because I know you were saying in 2012 that it was the ambivalence, the ambiguity around what you were showing that is what's appealing as art. So if you lose that tension because it goes down the scientific visualization path, then maybe doing it from different perspectives might be there's so much more to do, and you've done so much. Sean, do we have time for one more online question? Or?
Well, actually, Jeff sent me a message saying there are lots of questions about AI relating to AI, and I think it's the same in the room.
Sure.
Yeah, the specific question was how replaceable are artists by AI?
That's
That's
I
a
did
good
want to
one.
ask that.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Okay, so the big question. So the first challenge is the European view, probably the US view on artists is they're like the noble savage. You know, this idea of Picasso, the genius. Whereas if you put that aside and you say, what is it that an artist does? Makes aesthetic selections, they're good at drawing, they can use got a good sense of color, learned a bit about art history. You can take a more anatomical view to what an artist's role is. I personally think I am replaceable, probably as an artist within this system that we've created. It's going to take quite a lot of training data of stuff that comes from my repertoire, stuff that I like. But yeah, the artist probably is replaceable. Arguably, with this work, people have asked me, William, is it not, the artwork is nothing. That's just expression or an instance that you've generated. Isn't the artwork all the software that you've developed? That's where all your ideas are captured with Stephen and everyone. Isn't that the artwork? Because that's the Pandora's box, which is going to generate all this stuff. I personally think that human creativity is probably overrated. And what AI is revealing, whether we like it or not, the machine is better at spotting stuff that we can. Like when we're breeding stuff, the scene can be complete chaos, and it finds the best one to pick from. But I think the whole surge of interest and activity around AI has made us look more closely at what being human is. And I think probably the human artist is replaceable and probably makes it more democratic because everyone else can take part. You know, it isn't the singular role of a singular artist, it becomes more collective. But yeah, that's a very good question, but thank you.
I'm just going to add the very last statement on top of that, which is, I think, notwithstanding the truth of that and the fact that you've collaborated throughout your work, there's something very